Hey folks, welcome to the Ramble. There have been a few more developments regarding the sexual harassment and abuse allegations made against Lawrence Krauss, so I'm going to make another video talking about it because one of the problems in the atheist and skeptical community is many people have known about problems like this all along, and nobody has wanted to talk about it. And god damn it, I would love to see that come to an end, because the problems are never going to be solved or even meaningfully addressed until we get over ourselves and start talking about these problems as though they were real, instead of pretending, as many people in the community would still like to do, that these are just fringe concerns, that it's just a few bad apples, and that it's not worthy of serious, sustained attention. To hell with that. The first development was that Lawrence Krauss last week released his official response to all of these charges. It's a 9-page document that he linked to on his Twitter account, and you can go find it and read it yourself if you are of a mind. It boils down to blame BuzzFeed, cry victim, blame BuzzFeed not only for, as Krauss says, libeling him, but also mischaracterizing and demeaning and insulting the integrity and besmirching the honor of the atheist community. Because it's certainly not a den of sexism and other forms of intolerance and a haven for harassers and abusers. That would just be preposterous. How dare BuzzFeed say what many people in the atheist community have been saying for years. The American Humanist Association announced last week, on Friday actually, that it was cutting all of its ties with Lawrence Krauss as a result of these allegations. And the FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, made a similar announcement as well, saying that they were removing Krauss from their honorary board as a result of this. And even CFI / the Richard Dawkins Foundation announced that they were suspending their association with Krauss. They didn't go quite as far as the AHA or FFRF did and make any definitive statement, but they said, well, we're suspending Krauss until we can investigate. I guess, what does investigate mean? Read the article a few more times and give it a few more weeks to see if it blows over, and then they can quietly sneak Krauss back in, as many of us expect is going to happen. But I want to focus on the AHA response, because I think it has been the best so far of any of the major organizations in the atheist community. And just to put my cards on the table, I am a member of the American Humanist Association. Actions like this make me very happy and open and proud to be a supporter of the AHA. The AHA board has voted to, and this is from their statement on their website, the AHA board has voted to remove Lawrence Krauss from the pool of potential speakers, writers, or presenters. That's probably the most important part of the statement, and I'll get back to that in a second. They have also placed Krauss's 2015 Humanist of the Year award in administrative review while they come up with a formal process to make a determination as to what to do permanently with that, if they revoke the award from him or not. And hopefully that is what will happen, because he does not, a man like Lawrence Krauss does not deserve a Humanist of the Year award. And they will also improve the Humanist of the Year award selection process to have a more in-depth inquiry into potential candidates' personal ethics, reputations, and actions to ensure they are in accordance with humanist values as AHA states them. And then they will also create new policy to formalize and stipulate what their actions will be in circumstances like this in the future. All of it is very good. The most important element of it, though, as I said, is their decision to remove Krauss from their pool of potential speakers, writers, or presenters. In other words, that means we're not going to use him anymore. We're not going to publish him. We're not going to promote his work. We're not going to give him our platform or use our platform to amplify his work and his message. We are not going to send him out to represent us or to stand for humanist values in the name of our association. We are not going to have anything to do with him in the future. That is the most important thing, and the thing that I wish every skeptical atheist organization and conference and podcast host and et cetera, would come out and say, we're doing that from now on, and it's because of these sexual harassment and abuse allegations that have been made against Krauss by so many credible, believable people. But it's a good start, and hopefully the AHA's example will be followed by other organizations and other conference organizers, etc. There was a line here from Roy Speckart, because he's the executive director of the AHA, and he has a quote in the statement where he says, "There was a time when non-theist organizations wouldn't appropriately address unethical conduct of their leaders, seeming to prioritize outspoken secularism above all else." And I had a chuckle with one of my buddies on Facebook about this, where we said, yeah, there was a time, and it's a long past mist-shrouded era that today we call last week. This isn't, hopefully this is the turning of the page. And to be fair, Speckert goes on in his statement to express some optimism and say, I hope that some progress is apparent and some progress is being made, and we are turning that page, and non-theist organizations will not behave this way anymore. They will wake up and they will realize that they have been derelict in their responsibilities, and this will be a moment for real change going forward. So, and I hope that's true, because you can't ignore the fact that things, especially in this realm, in the way that women are treated in skeptical atheist circles, in the tolerance for harassers and abusers and bigots and various other agents of ignorance and intolerance, they have been excused and welcomed and protected because, as Speckert says in his statement, secularism, outspoken secularism, was valued above all else. People knew Lawrence Krauss was a dick and a creep, and possibly far, far worse, a harasser, an abuser, an assaulter, perhaps even. People knew this about him. Lots of people knew this about him. But he was still welcomed. He was still invited. He was still put up on a pedestal as one of our thought leaders, as an example of science and secularism and atheism and humanism, because he was good at that. Because he could give a good speech, because he had impressive credentials, because he was funny and charming and a good representative. And his personal life and the fact that he was known to be a harasser and perhaps even far worse when it came to women was ignored, was just brushed aside. And I think it's a damn shame that it took this long and that it took embarrassing mainstream coverage for this to happen, because this is not a new problem, and there have been plenty of people within the community that have been talking about this for years, and virtually nothing has been done. So it's a shame that it took BuzzFeed to shine a light on it for something to get done, but at least something is hopefully getting done. Now, of course, not all of the responses within the secular, atheist, skeptical circle to Krauss have been as encouraging as the AHA's. I have seen a lot of people in comments on my videos. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter running to Krauss's defense, especially after he released his statement, his response, which was just deny, deny, deny. BuzzFeed is out to get me. BuzzFeed is out to get us. Is out to, harm the atheist movement. There are a lot of people giving a lot of responses, and I want to cover a few of those responses, the ones that I have been seeing most often from the greatest number of people. And the first one of those is, what about due process? What the hell ever happened to due process? And this is a topic that a lot of other people have already talked about. We talked about it when I had Manette Richards on for a hangout last week, where we spent most of our hour-and-a-half conversation talking about Krauss and the larger issues surrounding the Krauss story. And one of the things that was brought up was the difference between legal due process and coming to a reasonable conclusion apart from a legal verdict, and how most forms of sexual harassment are not criminal, but because they are not criminal, that does not mean that they are therefore acceptable. And no one ever said that the Me Too movement or the Time's Up movement were dedicated entirely to criminal assault. It covers all kinds of behavior that is unacceptable. And while there are certainly distinctions being made, contrary to what Sam Harris thinks, nobody has ever said that the only people who should get in trouble are people who have committed criminal assault. Much of what Krauss is accused of would not rise to the level of criminal assault. Doesn't mean that it's appropriate. So if a person isn't accused of committing criminal assault, if a person is accused of being inappropriate, of being a harasser, of being an abuser, but not to the level that they could be criminally charged and perhaps sentenced and fined or sent to prison for it, then why are we insisting on a legal standard of innocent until proven guilty? And is that a standard that we really apply consistently in our lives? Or is that just an excuse that people are making because they don't want to reach the obvious conclusion that Lawrence Krauss did this shit and that he's a blemish on the community and that he is but one of many such people in our midst that we have knowingly protected all these years? Because that's a really, really damning thing to admit. It's a thing that we must admit because it's a truth. It's one of the great unspoken truths about the atheist community that we have to reconcile ourselves with and have to do something about if we hope to be of some use in this world. But it's a difficult thing to face. So instead of facing it, people are hiding and they're coming up with excuses and they're saying things like, what about due process? And related to that, well, I'm a skeptic. I'm not a judge. It's not for me to decide whether or not Lawrence Krauss did this. I can acknowledge that he has been accused, and I can also acknowledge that he is denying it. So therefore, it's not for me to conclude one way or the other. What unbelievable horseshit that is. Thomas Smith came up with a really good analogy for why that way of thinking is total horseshit on an episode of his podcast, Serious Inquiries Only, last week, where he dealt with this problem. He dealt with the Krauss response after previously devoting an episode to the allegations. And Thomas said, if you're an employer and someone interviews for a job at your firm and you call around to check their references and everybody you talk to, or almost everybody you talk to, warns you not to hire that person, are you going to just ignore them and say, well, it's their word against his? Are you going to give no weight to their testimony at all? Or are you going to take that in and say, gee, he gave me 4 references, 3 of them flat out told me not to hire him. And they had some pretty specific, serious allegations to make against him that don't rise to criminality, but sound like the kind of things I wouldn't want to have around the office. Are you going to hire that person? Are you going to say, well, it's not really for me to judge. It's not for me to come to a conclusion. He seems like a nice guy. He says he didn't do any of these things. These people say he did. Therefore, what can I do? I'm powerless. I must remain agnostic about this. I just find that a completely indefensible position. And I refuse to believe that most people actually live their lives that way. I just don't think that is practically the case. And it's certainly not what skepticism is about. Skepticism does not mean withholding judgment even when the conclusion is painfully obvious. Skepticism means investigate. Look for good reasons. Look for evidence. Don't just jump to conclusions on bad evidence or based on your biases or your prejudices, but at the same time, when the evidence is there, when a credible, believable case has been made that one particular conclusion is far more likely than others, then it's reasonable to come to that conclusion and to say, you know what, I think that's probably true. And in this case with Lawrence Krauss, I don't see how anyone else can come to any other conclusion unless they have an agenda, which is protecting Lawrence Krauss and protecting the imaginary, fictitious good name of the atheist community, as a lot of people are brazenly doing. I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion. It has nothing to do with due process. It has nothing to do with being a good skeptic and wanting to wait until all the evidence has come in, which in this case would mean that you have to ignore all the evidence that has already come in. You have to pretend that the BuzzFeed article itself doesn't brim over with evidence. You have to just pretend that that doesn't count. That's another common response I've seen, which Krauss himself used quite blatantly in his response. Oh, it's BuzzFeed. Who are you going to believe? BuzzFeed? If that article had been written by another outlet, if that article that was published in BuzzFeed had been printed word for word in the New York Times or the Washington Post, would that make it more credible? The fact that it was published by BuzzFeed, and BuzzFeed has a certain reputation for publishing clickbait, which is not entirely undeserved, that means nothing. That has nothing to say about the validity of the charges made in the article. Because BuzzFeed is a very bad defense of Lawrence Krauss. But then again, there are no good defenses of Lawrence Krauss because the case against him is overwhelming. But there's another attempt to defend him that I have seen from people, and that is from the people who acknowledge that the case against Krause is so overwhelming that it can't reasonably be denied. But instead of denying that Krause did the things that he is charged with doing in the BuzzFeed article, they simply adopt the position that what Krause did was not that bad. That, yeah, he did all that stuff, but he didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with any of that. I've seen people saying, well, if the only thing he's being charged with is trying to get laid, then check back with me when you find evidence that he's done something bad. So sexual harassment is fine. I mean, come on, the guy's just trying to get laid. What's a guy supposed to do? He's an awkward, nerdy science guy. Maybe he can't read people's signals. Maybe he gets a little overexcited when he's in the company of women. He's not used to all this attention. He's been a famous physicist for 20 years. He's been coming and going at conferences where he's treated like royalty for quite a while now. His level of fame that he has attained, and as others have pointed out, he's not a household name. He's not super famous in the broader world, but within the scientific and skeptical atheist community, he's one of the most well-known people there is, and he's been accustomed to that level of attention and reverence given to him for quite a while now, so you can't really chalk it up to, oh, the guy, he's poor, he's just an awkward nerd, he doesn't know how to be around people. He's had enough time, don't you think, to make the adjustment? He's had enough time to figure out how he's supposed to be around people, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. I don't really think that's a good excuse. And that ignores the fact that the first charge made against him in the BuzzFeed article is throwing a woman onto a bed, climbing on top of her, and attempting to take her pants off. Attempting to force himself on a woman sexually. Is that okay because dude's just trying to get laid? Hey, come on, what's he supposed to do? How's he ever going to have sex with anybody if he doesn't throw women onto beds, climb on top of them, and attempt to forcibly undress them? Guy's just trying to get laid, right? Do you hear yourselves when you say these things? Or when you type them into your keyboard or into your phone? Do you have any comprehension of the things you're saying? Oh, sure, Krause did all that stuff, but, I mean, come on. Boys will be boys, right? And then, of course, there are the people, including Krause himself, again, who insist that the accusers and their various corroborating witnesses are all just making these things up maliciously. They're just making these things up maliciously to harm Lawrence Krause because that's just what happens when you get famous. Krause himself says that. He's quoted as saying that in the BuzzFeed article. Hey, I'm a famous guy. This is what happens to famous people. It requires no further explanation. They just do it because people are famous. And I guess it makes sense because we all know how well treated women who accuse men who are more powerful than they are of sexual abuses. We all know how well treated they are. Why we venerate our sexual abuse victims in this country, don't we? We don't subject them to cruelty and doubt and derision and gaslighting. We don't try to demean them and assassinate their character and undermine their integrity and undermine the validity of their stories. No. We treat them with great respect, don't we? Most of the people who are making that argument, who are saying that women are just doing these things to get back at Lawrence Krause for some reason, or to bring him down, or to make themselves famous, to get attention for themselves. Most of the people who make that argument have no idea who Allison Smith is. They've never heard her name. Allison Smith is the woman who accused, and still accuses, Michael Shermer of raping her. And this ties into another thing that Krause said in his article, in his response to the article, rather, and that other people have been parroting and saying on their own for years. This idea that, well, the statement that the atheist and skeptical community has a problem with sexism and misogyny, among other problems, that's overstated. Seth Andrews beats that drum a lot, and fuck him, because he should know better. Oh, it's just a few bad apples. It shouldn't be used to tarnish the whole movement. Yeah, sure, there are some atheists who are sexist and misogynist. There are some. But they don't really count. There's just a few people. The overall movement is just fine. We shouldn't concern ourselves, and we shouldn't spend any time talking about it, and we shouldn't dare suggest that people with popular podcasts spend time talking about it and educating their audiences and giving voice to the various people who are trying to talk about these things. No, that's just a waste of time. Hey, what's that over there? And how do you think it feels to Alice Smith or to the many, many other women who have similar stories? To have told their stories in many cases, to have told their stories multiple times over a course of years. And to have people like Seth Andrews and Matt Dillahunty, or until recently, the leaders of major skeptical organizations and organizers of major conferences, just ignore them. Just act like they're not saying anything. Just turn their backs. And not only that, they continue to treat the men who are accused as though nothing happened. Lawrence Krauss was a known entity for years, was treated like a celebrity in atheist circles. Michael Shermer, for years, even before Krauss in many cases. I knew about Shermer before I knew about Krauss. Still gets invited, still gives talks, still gets treated as a reputable source, as someone with an opinion who matters. In fact, Matt Dillahunty was going to appear on stage with him in Austin until people started to notice that Matt Dillahunty sure was hanging around with a lot of famous accused rapists, and then the heat got a little too high, and then he decided, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. Not because he had a problem appearing on stage or appearing at events alongside accused rapists, because clearly he had no problem with that. But people were just starting to notice and give him a little too much shit about it. So he decided maybe I should back. Maybe now if this is going to hurt my career, then maybe I should stop. That's the kind of integrity we need in the secular community. People who will stick their neck out for nobody. But when it becomes a little too damaging to their reputation to consort with accused rapists and sexual harassers, then they'll say, okay, I'm out. Thanks a lot. What great leadership. What great skepticism. Boy, I sure am glad that I'm on this side and not with those terrible religious people with all their corrupt, toxic morality. We're so much better than they are over here on this side, aren't we? How do you think it feels to be someone like Alice Smith or Melody Hensley or one of the numerous other women who have spoken out about things like this? To be ignored and to have the men who assaulted them continue to be praised and celebrated by virtually the entire community. Do you think they think there might be a problem with sexism and misogyny in the atheist community when we ignore the testimony of dozens of women who make very serious charges against men, but we continue to treat the men who are charged like royalty? You think that might indicate a certain level of sexism that is pervasive in our community, that isn't just a few bad apples, but is something that harms everyone in this community and should be acknowledged and dealt with? You think maybe that might be something we could look at? You think maybe if you have a platform in this community, especially if you have a career, if your bills are paid because you're supported by people in this community, that maybe you have some essential responsibility to shed light on this, to be on the right side of this, to get off the fucking fence and say what to many people has been obvious for years. Or are you just going to, as Thomas Smith said during his excellent podcast on this subject, are you just going to keep seeing which way the wind blows? Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, it's definitely turning against Krauss now, so now I'm going to come out and say I believe the accusers, and I'm going to cut all ties with Lawrence Krauss. Oh, they're turning against Shermer now. Okay, now it's safe to come out and say that I think Michael Shermer is a terrible guy. Yeah, it's safe for me now. When Sam Harris appeared on stage with Matt Dillahunty recently in Phoenix, Arizona, at an event that was originally also to have included Lawrence Krauss before the BuzzFeed article was published, Harris said that, it's his instinct to believe accusers when things like this happen. It's important, he said. It's important to believe women when they make these sorts of charges. But then he spent most of his time addressing that issue, talking about how many red flags there were in the BuzzFeed article and how many indications of bad faith on the part of the reporters there were, and how it's very serious, this subject, very serious, because their colleague, Lawrence Krauss, was under assault and his reputation was at risk. I should probably remind you at this point, remember a few years ago when a reporter asked Sam Harris about sexism, the lack of women's representation in the atheist community, and grilled him just a little bit on the subject. And then after he talked to her, he posted this incredibly lengthy, tedious, self-absolving blog post titled, "I'm not the sexist pig you're looking for." Does that sound like someone who's not a sexist pig? Or who is not contributing to a culture of sexism and misogyny and erasure of women in his community when he gives a token statement of, oh yeah, it's very important to believe accusers when something like this happens. And then he makes it absolutely crystal clear that his real concern is the reputation of his man friend who has been accused. We have to take this seriously, not because women have been assaulted and harassed for years. No, not because of that. Because our colleague's reputation is at risk. That's why he's not here, by the way, Sam Harris told the audience there. That's why he's not here, because if he had been here, then he would have been forced to respond to these allegations, and we wouldn't have been able to talk about science tonight, and that wouldn't have been fair. But it's important to believe the accusers. It has to be more than just getting rid of the Lawrence Krausses, because the people who propped him up have to be held accountable too. That's the really pervasive problem. That's why the Lawrence Krausses and the Michael Shermers have been allowed to exist and to prosper in the first place. Because they had people willing to prop them up, willing to stand in front of them, willing to form walls of silence around them when these accusations cropped up from time to time in the past. That must stop as well. And people with platforms, with microphones, with large audiences who willfully ignore charges made like the ones made against Krauss because they would rather associate themselves with the famous guy. They'd rather try to raise their own profile and help their own career by associating with the famous guy, and they don't want to risk alienating their audiences or burning their bridges with Lawrence Krauss or Michael Shermer or who else. They'd rather have the audience. They'd rather have the prestige of having their face on a fucking poster or being able to say, I stood on a stage and participated in an event with Lawrence Krauss, the great physicist, with Michael Shermer, the publisher of Skeptic magazine. They'd rather be able to do that than do the right thing and say, you know what, maybe this will hurt my career. Maybe this is something that will diminish my standing in this community given the state of things. But you know what? Fuck that guy. I do believe those women. I do take what they say seriously, and I am going to not just say that, but demonstrate it. I'm going to cut all ties with this person. I'm going to refuse to appear at any conference that they're invited. At any conference that wants me, I'm going to insist that they don't have such people there. How about that? And maybe I will make a little bit less money. Maybe I will lose some subscribers or some listeners or what have you. But you know what? It's worth it. It's worth it that I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror, that I'll be able to say, at least I did the most basic, essential, right thing that I could do. And said, I'm not going to appear on stage with an alleged rapist or sexual harasser. I'm certainly not going to do that while I say that I believe women out of the other side of my fucking mouth. That must stop just as much as the behavior of the Krausses and the Shermers. That must be condemned and it must not be tolerated.